So the minimum wage is one of the most debated topics amongst American politics. From the left's perspective, it is a good wage floor for people getting into the job market to have that security that they are making at minimum a decent livable wage. And that is why a lot of people on the left think we need to increase the minimum wage. A lot of people supported Bernie Sanders' federal minimum wage of $15. Right now, the current minimum wage is at $7.25 an hour, so that's a big difference. That's doubling the minimum wage currently. And the right is also kind of split. Some people just think we should keep the minimum wage where it's at, and then there's the large majority of the right which thinks we shouldn't have one at all. We should let the free market decide wages, and not letting the free market decide wages actually not only hurts people at minimum wage, but also hurts the businesses that have to pay out the minimum wage. So in this video, I thought I would just go over some of the economic theory and some empirical studies about the minimum wage and kind of tell you my conclusion on whether it's good, bad, whether we should increase it or not. So that's pretty much the whole topic of this video. So if we look at basic laws of supply and demand to see what an increase in the minimum wage will do, it kind of justifies the right's argument. So up on the screen, we have a supply and demand graph with the x-axis being the quantity of labor and the y-axis being wages. If we say W0 is what wages are currently at, let's say $10, and the minimum wage is increased to 15, which goes to W1, you will see a left movement along the demand curve. And basically what this means is if the minimum wage increases, it entices more people to enter the workforce, right? Because now they might finally feel that minimum wage is at a level where they feel comfortable finally getting a job and making that much money. What this does will decrease the quantity of labor demanded by corporations. If the labor market is bigger and they have more opportunity, they will most likely demand less workers, or they will just fill up on all the workers that they need, that they don't need anymore. So demand for workers will go down. So while demand for workers goes down, supply of workers would increase because of, the minimum wage increase, leaving a lot more people without jobs. And businesses will likely hire less workers because of the wage increase, or they will lay off other workers to keep labor and business costs down, or instead they will just pass these extra labor costs onto the consumer goods that they sell, meaning that the price of like a hamburger might be more expensive if you increase the minimum wage on fast food workers and that sort of thing. So that's the basic supply and demand laws and the minimum wage, but this doesn't tell the whole story, and that's my biggest problem with economics in general, is trying to explain away these big economic policies with just simple supply and demand laws. A simple supply and demand graph doesn't tell the whole story, and we need a more nuanced discussion around this. In May of 1996, the Joint Economic Committee Republicans released a paper called The Case Against a Higher Minimum Wage, where they go into more detail on why we should not have a higher minimum wage. So we are going to be looking at that and picking this paper apart. One of the first reasons they list, which pretty much coincides with what I said about the basic laws of supply and demand when it comes to the minimum wage, was that raising the minimum wage causes job losses, specifically entry-level jobs, obviously because entry-level jobs are the jobs that pay minimum wage starting off. And the job losses come because companies will fire workers so that they don't have to pay as many workers the new increased wages to cut back on labor costs or to avoid passing the costs on to the consumers so their products aren't as expensive. Now, another argument against raising the minimum wage that they list is basically that it's not needed. It doesn't help the poor. Just a reminder that this paper was released in 1996, so these numbers are a little outdated. Only 2.8% of workers earning less than $5 are single parents. Only 1.2% of all minimum wage workers were adult heads of households with an income less than $10,000. 57% of minimum wage workers are single individuals, many of them living with their parents. They also go on to say only 9.2% of poor people of working age have full-time jobs, and about 60% do not work at all. What they're arguing here is that raising the minimum wage doesn't help poor people because most poor people aren't working minimum wage jobs. That's why they list data like, oh, well, these minimum wage workers, 57% of them live with their parents. Only 1.2% of all minimum wage workers were adult heads of households with incomes less than $10,000. They list data points off like this, but it's very disingenuous, and they're just misconstruing what this data means, and they're leaving out context. Specifically, when we go to adult heads of households with incomes less than $10,000, in order to be considered a household, you obviously have to have more than one person living under the same roof, right? So a person living in an apartment by themselves alone is not considered a household. So this 1.2% of all minimum wage workers were adult heads of households with an income less than $10,000, leaves out a lot of poor people that, one, make over $10,000, and two, live alone. So this data point is pretty disingenuous in that way because it leaves out a lot of context and it leaves out a lot of minimum wage workers that aren't heading households. Another paper kind of furthers this argument by Richard Vedder and Lowell Gallaway called "Should the Federal Minimum Wage Be Increased?" Like I said earlier, they also say that only 9.2% of poor people of working age have a full-time job, and about 60% do not work at all. So this is another argument for why minimum wage increases don't help the poor, right? And it makes sense on the surface level. How could this help the poor that much if only 9.2% of poor people work full-time jobs and 60% do not work at all? Well, for one, it's important to note that while some poor people don't have full-time jobs, that doesn't mean they don't work full-time hours. They might work 2 part-time jobs or maybe even 3 part-time jobs that add up to full-time hours, but they don't technically have a full-time job. A study and a survey by the Economic Policy Institute found that a majority of poor people who can work do work. Currently, 65% of people in poverty are eligible to work. And of that 65%, 63% are working full-time, 37% are not working at all. So the idea that 60% of poor people do not work is very flawed. So the idea that poor people don't work is ludicrous. It's nonsense. The idea that, the minimum wage and raising wages won't help the poor because they just don't work is ridiculous. So we've pretty much debunked the idea that poor people don't work, right? And that poor people don't work minimum wage jobs. That's largely untrue. They do. But just from a basic economic standpoint, does raising the minimum wage help economic growth and these people's economic situation, or does it hurt? Well, let's look at one study from the effects of the $20 California fast food minimum wage. So if you don't know, I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago, California raised the minimum wage to $20 for just fast food workers. So not every worker in the restaurant industry, not every minimum wage workers, just fast food workers got a $20 minimum wage. And it's been a decent enough time to where an empirical study has come out to actually show the effects of this minimum wage increase. And the study is called "The Effects of the $20 California Fast Food Minimum Wage Highlights." So we're going to take a look at this study and see what the outcomes of the study were. First, let's look at how this study was conducted. They used 3 control groups: fast food restaurants in states that have not changed their minimum wage policies, small California fast food restaurants that were not covered by the policy for reasons of like unaffordability and that sort of thing, and full-service California restaurants that were also not subject to the policy. So they're still restaurants, but just not fast food restaurants, obviously. So what the study does is compare before and after differences in the outcomes, which is obviously pretty self-explanatory. They also look at before-after differences in full-service restaurants and in California and elsewhere, just to see the side effects of this policy. How did raising the minimum wage for just fast food workers affect workers in other restaurant industries? So first, let's look at the effects of this minimum wage policy on employment. As you can see, the dotted red line is fast food in other U.S. states, and the dotted blue line is full-service restaurants in other U.S. states, whereas the red full line is fast food restaurants in California, and the blue line is full-service in California. So with this in mind, the dotted maroon line that's going parallel to the y-axis is the time and when the minimum wage policy, the $20 minimum wage policy, was put into effect. And as you can see, full service and fast food employment in California continued to increase and grow at a steady rate after the minimum wage increase. However, compared to other states, they grew at a slower pace. So the good news is you don't see an actual dip in employment numbers after the minimum wage increase, but you do see a slower overall level of growth when compared to the rest of the states that were studied. When we really delve into the employment, you can see that the fast food employment in California continued to grow, granted at a lower rate than the rest of fast food employment in the United States, while full-service employment actually decreased. And the biggest factor is probably just some full-service employees leaving to go to California fast food employment instead, right? So that's why you see a decrease in full service, and this actually will create more job openings in full service for more people to break into opportunity. And it also still grows steady when compared to full service in total in the United States. So it's not really concerned that full service employment in California did not increase nearly as much as fast food employment did. I think overall this is a very positive outlook. So, if increasing wages are supposed to have such a drastic effect on unemployment, why was employment pretty much stable and continued to grow after the policy implementation? Well, it has to do a lot with prices. Specifically, the study does state that in the first quarter after the minimum wage policy was put in place, the results indicate that the policy led to price increases of about 4.1% in California for fast food chains. This is relative to the control states, of course. However, between the first and second quarters, prices grew faster in the control states than in California. The overall increase 2 quarters after the policy is 1.5%, or about 6 cents for a $4 hamburger. This pattern suggests that chains may have initially overestimated the likely cost of the policy. So what this tells us is actually over the next 2 quarters that this policy was implemented, we only saw a price growth of 1.5%, which is pretty average, and it equates to if you had a $4 hamburger, the price would only increase to $4.06. So even adjusted for inflation, this doesn't really hurt people's wages after the wage increase. And that right there is the problem I have with basic supply and demand laws and using them to try to discuss how minimum wage would affect the economy. Because what supply and demand forgets to account for is just basic worker productivity. Because if a company increases productivity, for example, if workers become more productive, they create more supply of whatever product they have to produce. And we all know basic supply and demand, if you increase supply, the price will drop. And we see this in another paper, The Payoffs of Higher Pay, Elasticities of Productivity and Labor Supply with Respect to Wages by Natalia, Emanuel, and Emma Harrington. After hourly pay in retail warehouses went up, worker productivity went up, and monthly turnover decreased. What this tells us is after workers are paid more, they have more incentive to work harder, to get another pay raise, that sort of thing. Right? So their productivity increases, and also the turnover, the rate in which people are leaving the company decreases. So increasing the minimum wage would actually increase productivity. The workers would be more productive, work harder, create more business for the company. So this would overall not affect prices because supply would grow by so much more than what it was before the minimum wage increase. Now, some would argue that yes, it's true, productivity does increase very drastically shortly after a wage increase. That does not last. After a couple more months at the new wage, workers will not be feeling as much on cloud 9 after getting this wage increase, right? They won't be feeling as comfortable after they have become used to the new level of wages they have, and thus productivity will drop back down. And while that's true, there is no evidence to support that the productivity decreases all the way back to the level that it was at before the initial wage increase. And also, with the higher productivity, they're more likely to get another wage increase, another raise, which would just boost productivity again. So overall, I think it's very important that a minimum wage exists, and we definitely need to increase it to at least keep up with inflation, right? And I don't think this is a policy that you can easily implement in 1 second. Like, I don't think we should raise the federal minimum wage from $7 to $15 within the next month. Like, this would have to be a gradual thing where you raise the minimum wage by, I don't know, $1 every single year until you eventually get to 15, because if you just double the minimum wage in 1 month or 2 months, then yes, you would see inflation, you would see inflated after effects of that. But that's not what any minimum wage policy is really trying to do. Even Bernie Sanders, who I'm a big fan of, his minimum wage proposals have never really been about raising the minimum wage to $15 like as soon as the bill passes. That's not what it's about. So yeah, if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys all in the next video.